After 30 years away, 76-year-old Navy veteran Abram Weller drove through a bright Montana snowstorm to ask his former wife one final question. But when he reached Bellwether Orchard, the house was rotting, the windows were boarded, and Dorothy had already been dead for nearly a year. In the frozen garden, an aging German shepherd named Kepler was chained to an irrigation post, starving, but still using his last strength to guard the empty house. Abram carried Kepler inside, repaired the broken roof, and discovered a room filled with letters Dorothy had written to him, but never found the courage to send. Those letters revealed a life of loneliness, a final promise for Kepler, and a home that was never meant to become anyone's private inheritance. Then the woman who had abandoned Dorothy returned with her violent husband, determined to seize the orchard before Abram could protect its true purpose. Before this story begins, tell us where you are watching from, and if you believe loyalty deserves a second chance, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. 3 weeks after the funeral of the last man who still remembered him young, Abram Weller stood in the middle of his small Nevada apartment and listened to the silence settle into the empty shelves. The apartment belonged to a veterans' housing complex outside Reno, a place built from beige walls, practical railings, and the quiet understanding that most of its residents had already learned how little a man truly needed. Abram had lived there for 11 years. He had never called it home. At 76, he had become skilled at leaving rooms without disturbing them. The mattress was stripped. 2 cardboard boxes sat near the door. His old field jacket hung over the back of a chair, faded olive green, the U.S. veteran patch softened by years of washing. The American flag on the sleeve had begun to fray at one corner. Abram had considered removing it more than once. He never had. He knelt beside the final box and immediately regretted the angle. His left knee tightened with a familiar, sour ache. "Still dramatic," he muttered. The knee did not answer. It had always been the more dignified of the two of them. Inside the box were things he had not looked at in years. A broken compass, 3 photographs from places he no longer visited in dreams, an old square-faced watch, and a blue metal tea tin with 1 dent along the rim. Abram stopped. The tin had once held Dorothy's favorite black tea. She had liked it strong enough to stain the cup and bitter enough to make guests suspicious. She used to add a thin slice of orange peel and claim it improved the flavor. Abram had always believed the orange peel merely gave the bitterness something decorative to wear. He turned the tin in his hands. Beneath it lay a postcard. The front showed Bellwether Orchard in late autumn, the apple trees heavy with red fruit beneath a pale Montana sky. The image had faded near the edges. On the back, Dorothy's handwriting tilted slightly uphill, as if every sentence had somewhere better to be. "The apple trees fruited late this winter. I think you would have liked seeing them. No accusation, no apology, no request." The postmark was almost 30 years old. Abram had never answered. He sat back on the floor, the postcard balanced between 2 fingers. His face, long and weathered, looked harder in the afternoon light than he felt. Deep lines crossed his forehead and gathered at the corners of his gray-blue eyes. His nose bent slightly left from an old break. White silver hair stood untidily at the crown, despite being trimmed close around his ears. He read the sentence again. Then the pain came. Not sharp, not dramatic. A pressure beneath the breastbone, heavy enough to make him place 1 palm on the floor. It lasted less than a minute. By the time it passed, Abram was sitting very still, breathing through his nose and staring at the blue tea tin. The clinic physician later told him it had not been a heart attack. "Think of it as a warning," she said. Abram had spent most of his life around warnings. Some came as static over a radio, some as a change in the wind, some as a man becoming too polite. This one had arrived in an empty apartment with a postcard in his hand. At the funeral 3 weeks earlier, his old teammate Miles Corbett had been buried beneath a hard blue sky. Miles had been the last of them who still called Abram Welly, a nickname Abram hated enough to miss now. Miles had left a note with the hospice nurse, not a speech. Miles had never trusted speeches. Don't carry the unsaid things into the ground. There's no room down there. Abram had almost laughed when he heard it. Instead, he had stood beside the coffin with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the earth receive another man who had once seemed impossible to kill. Now, seated on the floor, Abram looked from Miles's note to Dorothy's postcard. Two dead or dying voices had managed between them to say what the living Abram had avoided for 3 decades. Go back. He did not expect forgiveness. That would have been vanity disguised as hope. He did not expect reunion either. Dorothy had remarried years after their divorce. Franklin Crowder had been a widower, decent by all accounts, with an adult daughter named Lynette. After Franklin died, Lynette had moved into Bellwether Orchard. Abram had heard the news through an old acquaintance and had done what he did best. He had made a decision without asking a question. Dorothy had another family. A full one, a better-shaped one. He had told himself that staying away was kindness. Time had rewarded the lie by making it harder to challenge. Within 4 days, Abram loaded his boxes into a weathered pickup and pointed the hood north. He drove through Nevada, Idaho, then into Montana beneath a sky so clear it made distance look honest. Snow brightened the shoulders of the highway. Mountain shadows stretched blue across the valleys. The world seemed stripped of decoration. At a gas station outside Salmon, he bought coffee and a small bag of dog food without knowing why. The cashier glanced at the bag. Got a dog? No. She waited. Abram added, Apparently, I'm preparing for negotiations. She decided not to ask. By the second day, familiar names appeared on road signs. Whitmere Lake, Larkspur County, Bellwether Road. The years did not collapse. They did something worse. They remained. Whitmere Lake lay frozen beneath the afternoon sun, wide and silver, its surface crossed by dark seams. Abram remembered Dorothy skating there in a red scarf, laughing each time he nearly fell. He had been 26 and offended by gravity. The stone church still stood near the eastern bend, though the bell tower had been repaired with newer rock. June Ellicott's bakery occupied the same corner in town, its windows fogged with warmth. The painted sign had faded, but Abram recognized the shape of the lettering. He did not stop. Every landmark seemed to offer him a smaller chance to turn around. He passed them all. The road to Bellwether Orchard narrowed beyond the town limits. Snowbanks rose along the ditches. Old apple trees began appearing behind wire fences, their black branches twisting against the white fields. Abram's hands tightened around the steering wheel. He remembered returning from deployments and standing in the kitchen doorway while Dorothy spoke to him carefully, as if sudden movement might send him away again. She had wanted ordinary things. Dinner at the same hour, repairs finished before winter, a husband who did not scan restaurant windows for reflections. Abram had believed danger made him necessary. Domestic life had made him feel exposed. He re-enlisted more than once when he did not have to. Each time, he told Dorothy it was duty. Each time, there had been some truth in that. Truth he had learned too late could still be used as a hiding place. The marriage narrowed, then cracked, then became paperwork. When Dorothy later married Franklin, Abram told himself she had chosen correctly. When Lynette moved in after Franklin's death, Abram accepted the final shape of the story without ever hearing Dorothy's version. Silence became easier to maintain than to break. The orchard gate appeared after the next curve. Abram almost drove past it. The wooden sign had lost 2 letters. Snow clung to the carved name. Beyond it, the driveway disappeared beneath untouched white. He stopped the truck. For several seconds, he did not move. Then he noticed the chain. It ran from an old irrigation post near the center of the orchard to a dark shape lying beneath the trees. Abram opened the door. Cold air struck his face. Snow reached above his boots as he crossed the yard. The house stood behind the orchard, smaller than he remembered and much worse. One corner of the porch roof had collapsed. Several windows were boarded. A gutter hung loose like a broken arm. Snow had piled halfway up the fence. The dark shape moved. A German shepherd forced himself upright. He was large-framed, but terribly thin. His coat was black and dark amber, the yellow dulled to the color of old honey. A wide black saddle dipped unevenly over the right shoulder. His muzzle had gone silver. One ear stood straight. The other bore a small V-shaped tear along the edge. The dog planted himself between Abram and the house. A growl came from deep in his chest. It was not strong. That made it worse. Abram stopped 10 feet away. "All right," he said quietly. The dog's legs trembled. The chain pulled tight from a scarred patch around his neck. An overturned metal bowl lay frozen into the snow. Abram saw hunger, cold, exhaustion. But he saw something else first. Position. The dog was not trying to escape. He was guarding the door. Abram lowered the bag of dog food and the thermos of warm water he had brought from the truck. He poured a little water into the clean lid of a storage container and set softened food beside it. Then he sat down in the snow. His knee objected with vigor. "I know," Abram murmured. "Everyone has a complaint." The dog watched his hands, not his face. Abram turned slightly sideways and waited. The orchard was silent except for the wind moving through bare branches. Sunlight flashed across the snow with an almost cruel brightness. The dog's breath came in pale bursts. After a long time, the shepherd stepped toward the food, one pace, then another. He drank first, slowly, suspiciously. He ate only after Abram looked away. Abram waited until the dog had finished before reaching for the cutters in his truck toolkit. He moved carefully, showing the tool before approaching the irrigation post. The dog growled again but did not lunge. Abram cut the chain near the post. The metal fell into the snow. The shepherd stood free. For a moment, Abram expected him to run. Instead, the dog turned toward the house. He staggered once, recovered, and began walking to the porch with the broken length of chain dragging behind him. Abram followed. At the door, the dog stopped and looked back. Not inviting, measuring. Abram cleared ice from the lock with the edge of his tool. The key he still carried after 30 years did not fit. Of course it did not. Locks changed. People pretended they did not. He forced the damaged latch carefully enough not to split the frame. The door opened inward. Cold, stale air breathed from the house. Abram stepped inside first and left the door wide behind him. The shepherd remained on the porch. Abram waited in the dark entryway without calling him. At last, Claus crossed the threshold. The dog moved past Abram and stopped in the living room, head raised toward the hallway. Dust covered the furniture. Water stains spread across the ceiling. A vase of dead stems stood on the side table beneath the window. Something white rested under it. Abram crossed the room and lifted the folded paper. It was a funeral notice. Dorothy Weller, 73 years old, dead 11 months. The words did not blur. Abram wished they had. He lowered himself to the floor because his legs had become unreliable. The blue tea tin remained in his hand. Across the room, the shepherd lay down, still facing the hallway as if someone might come from it. Abram had driven more than 1,000 miles to ask Dorothy whether she had lived well. He had arrived with tea, an unanswered postcard, and 30 years of silence. The house gave him no answer, only a dying winter light, only a dog who would not stop guarding the empty rooms, only the terrible knowledge that some journeys ended not with a reunion, but with proof that time had kept moving without mercy. Kepler refused the truck. Abram had expected resistance when he opened the passenger door the next morning, but not the absolute stillness that came over the dog. Kepler stood beside the porch steps in the pale winter light, wearing no collar, only the loose strip of fabric Abram had tied around his chest to guide him without touching the injured skin around his neck. Snow had begun to melt from the roof in slow drops. Each one struck the porch rail with the patience of a clock. Abram placed a folded blanket across the passenger seat. "We are not discussing this for an hour," he said. Kepler looked toward the house. His amber-black body was still too thin beneath the fur. The notched left ear tilted backward. He did not pull away. He simply made his decision by refusing to move. Abram understood that kind of refusal. It was how men survived orders they could not openly disobey. He stepped aside, opened the rear door instead, and placed Dorothy's old wool scarf on the blanket. He had found it hanging beside the kitchen, stiff with dust, but still carrying a faint scent of cedar and dried lavender. Kepler approached. He smelled the scarf for a long time, then climbed into the truck with painful care. "That was manipulative," Abram said. Kepler lowered himself over the scarf. Abram shut the door gently. "I learned from experts." The veterinary clinic stood on the edge of Larkspur Valley, a low cedar building with snow piled beneath the windows and paw prints frozen into the walkway. A hand-painted sign read, "Vance Animal Care." Someone had added a smaller board underneath. "Patients may bite. Owners may explain." Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant, wet fur, and coffee, strong enough to remove paint, doctor. Laurel Vance came through the examination room door carrying a clipboard under one arm. She was 58, tall and broad-shouldered, with warm brown skin and black hair threaded with silver, gathered into a loose knot. Several curls had escaped near her temples. Her field coat was blue-gray and practical, its pockets carrying gauze, treats, and the accumulated evidence of a working life. She looked first at Abram, then at Kepler. The clipboard lowered. "Oh," she said. It was not surprise. It was recognition sharpened by grief. Kepler's head lifted. His body tightened, but he did not growl. Laurel turned sideways and crouched several feet away. "Hello, old man." Kepler's torn ears shifted forward. Abram watched the exchange. "You know him. I helped Dorothy train him." Laurel did not take her eyes off the dog, not as a service animal in the strict legal sense, more like a highly opinionated assistant. She placed her stethoscope on the floor and let Kepler smell it. He learned to bring her medication pouch, pull the bell cord, block stairs when she was dizzy, and find another person if she fell. Abram looked down at the dog. Kepler had guarded an empty hallway through the night. Laurel added quietly, "He also slept outside her room whenever her breathing was bad." The examination took nearly an hour. Kepler allowed Laurel to check his gums, listen to his chest, and feel along his ribs. He flinched when her hand approached his neck. Laurel stopped each time, waited, and tried again from another angle. Abram held nothing. He gave no commands. He remained where Kepler could see him. The dog was dehydrated and severely underweight. His rear left leg showed signs of arthritis, and the chain had rubbed raw patches beneath his thinning fur. Laurel found no fracture, no internal bleeding, no immediate reason he could not recover, but her expression remained hard. "This did not happen over 11 months, she said. Abram leaned against the wall. "How long?" "The serious weight loss? 5 or 6 weeks, maybe 7. Laurel removed her gloves. Before that, someone was feeding him, not enough perhaps, but regularly. Dorothy died 11 months ago. I know. The answer unsettled him more than he expected. For one night he had imagined Kepler wading through nearly a year of hunger, a faithful monument beside a dead woman's house. It had been tragic, but simple. The truth was uglier. Someone had kept the dog alive. Then someone had stopped. Laurel wrote down a feeding schedule and warned Abram not to give Kepler large meals. Small portions, warm water, no hard exercise, and no pressure on the neck. He won't leave the house willingly. He isn't refusing the house, Laurel said. He is refusing to abandon a duty he still thinks exists. Abram looked through the glass panel of the examination room door. Kepler lay on Dorothy's scarf, eyes open. What duty? Laurel met his gaze. You may have to let him show you. By noon, Abram was driving to the Larkspur Recovery Center. June Ellicott occupied a room overlooking a courtyard buried in snow. Abram recognized her before she recognized him. Age had narrowed her, but had not softened her. At 68, June had silver-brown hair pinned with a yellow pencil and a face built for skepticism. One leg rested beneath a blue blanket, immobilized from hip to ankle. A tray beside her held untouched pudding and a paperback murder mystery with 3 folded corners. She stared at Abram for several seconds. Then she said, "You took your time." There was no greeting in it. Abram removed his cap. "Yes." June glanced toward the window. "That answer saves us both energy." He told her about Kepler. The anger left her face before it left her hands. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. He's alive? For now. June closed her eyes. For a moment, Abram saw not the sharp woman behind the bakery counter, but someone who had been carrying dread without permission to put it down. After Dorothy passed, she said, Maris Claiborne hired Otis Fenner to check the house, feed Kepler, keep the pipes from freezing. He went every other day. Why did he stop? I don't know. He wouldn't answer me. June looked at Abram again. So I started going. You walk there every morning? I walked there when the road allowed. When it didn't, I used snowshoes and regretted every decision I'd made since 1974. Despite himself, Abram almost smiled. June did not. 3 months ago, I found Kepler chained outside. I called the sheriff's office. Lynette Crowder sent them paperwork saying she was arranging transport to a private kennel. Did anyone verify it? Deputy Ward called her. Lynette sounded official. People forgive a lot when someone sounds official. June had continued bringing scraps, dog food, warm broth, anything she could carry. Then 6 weeks earlier, she had fallen on the bakery steps and shattered her hip. I told the driver who took me here, she said. I told 2 nurses. I called again. Everyone said they would make a note. Her voice did not rise. That made the shame in it harder to hear. Abram looked at the immobilized leg. You kept him alive. I kept him waiting. No. June's eyes sharpened. Do not turn me into a saint because it makes the story easier. I should have found someone. I should have made more noise. Abram thought of 30 silent years. He had no right to comfort her with a lie. Instead, he said, Tell me where Otis lives. Otis Fenner's house sat behind an abandoned school bus at the edge of town. He opened the door only halfway. He was 66, narrow-shouldered, with a gray mustache, and hands stained by machine oil. His flannel shirt hung loose over a chest that seemed to have folded inward since retirement. When Abram mentioned Kepler, Otis looked toward the road. I was hired to feed him, he said. That's all. You stopped. Otis's jaw tightened. Abram did not move closer. Silence worked differently on frightened men. It could become pressure without needing force. At last, Otis opened the door wider. Travis Crowder came up there, he said. Wanted the shed unlocked. Said there were tools belonging to his father-in-law. Franklin's been dead 19 years. I told him that. What happened? Kepler got between him and the back door, didn't bite, just stood there. Otis swallowed. Travis looped a chain through the irrigation post and dragged him out. Said a kennel truck was coming the next day. You believed him? No. The word arrived broken. Otis rubbed both hands over his face. He told me he knew where my daughter worked, said accidents happened on winter roads. I left, and never went back. Otis looked at him then, fear giving way to anger. Easy for you to say. Abram felt the sentence land. Otis continued, people in this valley did small things for that house. June fed the dog. I kept the pipes alive until I got scared. Hector patched the roof last spring. Laurel checked on Dorothy for free. And you? The front gate creaked behind Abram. A man stood there holding a toolbox. Hector Boone was shorter than Abram remembered, though age had likely changed both measurements. He wore brown canvas overalls beneath an olive work coat lined with cream wool. A red carpenter's pencil rested behind one ear. His beard was white, rough, and too long to be accidental. Hector looked at Abram without surprise. You found Otis, he said. I did. Then you found out none of us behaved as well as we tell ourselves. Otis looked away. Abram felt heat rise behind his ribs. Travis chained the dog. Yes. He threatened this man. Yes. And everyone let it remain that way. Hector set the toolbox down. Everyone? He asked. The word cut cleanly. Abram said nothing. Hector stepped closer, not threateningly, but without mercy. June crossed a snowfield with a bad hip. Otis kept showing up until fear got the better of him. Laurel trained the dog. Maris kept the property from being sold out from under Dorothy. What did you do? Abram's jaw tightened. Hector's voice softened, which made it worse. You disappeared for 30 years and came back angry that the rest of us failed during the last 6 weeks. The cold seemed to sharpen around them. Abram looked toward the mountains beyond the rooftops. He had no defense that did not sound like biography. That afternoon, he returned to Bellwether Orchard with food, medicine, roofing tar, and a decision he did not announce until Hector arrived behind him in an old green truck. You followed me, Abram said. I brought a ladder. Don't make it sentimental. They worked until the light faded. Hector patched the worst section of roof while Abram cleared broken plaster and coaxed heat from the old stove. Kepler remained inside, moving from room to room with stiff, deliberate steps. He did not settle in the living room. Every time Abram approached the narrow hallway, Kepler moved ahead of him and lay across the doorway of the old sewing room. Not snarling, not threatening, simply present. Abram stopped testing the boundary. Over the next several days, the house changed by inches. The stove held heat. Water ran through one repaired pipe. Snow stopped falling through the ceiling above the pantry. Kepler began carrying objects. The first was a wool glove placed near the back door, then a wooden spoon left beside the stove. Then Dorothy's faded shawl, dragged carefully from beneath a chair and laid across the threshold of the sewing room. Abram assumed the behavior was random until Laurel visited and watched Kepler move the spoon. Dorothy taught him retrieval routines, she said. Objects connected to tasks. Gloves meant outside. Spoon meant kitchen. Shawl may have meant rest. He is repeating her day. Perhaps. Why? Laurel looked at Kepler. Because routine is sometimes the last place grief feels orderly. That evening, Hector and Abram sat on the roof with their boots braced against a ridge of old shingles. The sky had turned violet beyond Whitmere Lake. Hector drove a nail, then another. Why didn't you write? He asked. Abram kept his eyes on the roof seam. I thought she had moved on. That was not my question. Abram's fingers tightened around the hammer. Hector waited. Finally, Abram said, "Because every year made the first sentence harder." Hector nodded once. Then he asked, "You could cross oceans to bring strangers home. Why couldn't you cross one sheet of paper for the woman who slept beside you?" Abram had no answer. That night he divided Kepler's food into a small bowl and set it near the stove. Kepler approached, smelled it, then gripped the rim gently in his teeth. He carried the bowl across the room. Abram watched him place it beside Dorothy's empty chair. Kepler stood there for a moment waiting. No footsteps came. No hand reached down. At last he ate. Abram sat on the floor across from him, the repaired stove clicking behind them. He understood then that Kepler was not guarding a secret. He was preserving a schedule. A woman should sit in that chair. A glove should wait by the door. A spoon belonged near the stove. A shawl meant someone was tired. Food was eaten only after everyone was accounted for. Kepler had kept the shape of Dorothy's life intact because no one had told him what to build after it ended. Abram looked toward the dark hallway. "I'll stay until you're strong," he said. Kepler continued eating. "And until the house is warm." The dog did not look at him. Abram added, "That is not ownership." Kepler lifted his head then. For one brief second, their eyes met. Not agreement, not trust. Only two old creatures acknowledging that neither of them knew how long temporary things could last. Maris Claiborne came to Bellwether Orchard on a morning so bright the snow seemed to have sharpened every edge in the valley. Abram saw her car moving slowly along the unplowed drive, dark and deliberate between the white rows of apple trees. Kepler heard it first. He rose from the rug beside the stove, body tense, then looked toward Abram rather than the door. That was new. Abram set down the length of bell cord he had been repairing. "Wait," he said. Kepler remained standing, but he did not move ahead of him. Maris stepped onto the porch carrying a charcoal leather case and a narrow stack of folders pressed against her coat. At 60, she was small, straight-backed, and arranged with the precision of someone who trusted preparation more than charm. Her gray steel hair curved neatly along her jaw. Thin copper-framed glasses rested low on her nose, and snow gathered on the shoulders of her dark olive coat without appearing to inconvenience her. She looked at the damaged porch roof, the temporary boards across one window, then at Abram. "You have begun repairs." The roof objected to waiting for permission. Roofs often misunderstand jurisdiction. Her voice was dry enough that Abram needed a second to recognize the humor. Maris stepped inside. Kepler stood near Dorothy's empty chair. His head remained low, his eyes fixed on the leather case. Maris stopped rather than approach him. "Kepler," she said softly. The torn left ear shifted. "You know him," Abram said. "I knew where he preferred to lie when Dorothy and I discussed matters she found unpleasant." "Near the door?" "On my coat." Kepler did not confirm this. Maris placed the case on the dining table, removed her gloves, and aligned a black fountain pen beside the first folder. She did not sit until Abram did. That, too, felt deliberate. "I need to explain what Dorothy created," she said, "and what she did not." Abram looked toward the hallway. Kepler had returned to the sewing room door. Maris opened the folder. Bellwether Orchard, she explained, had not been left directly to Abram in the ordinary sense. Dorothy had placed the house, orchard, greenhouse, and most of her remaining savings into a living trust that became irrevocable upon her death. The trust had three stated purposes. The first was to maintain Bellwether Orchard as residential and agricultural property. The second was to provide for Kepler's care for the remainder of his life. The third was to develop a small winter community program Dorothy had named the Winter Table. Abram leaned back. "What is that?" "An idea more than an organization. Dorothy wanted one day each week when people living alone could come for a meal, bring their animals, sit somewhere warm, and leave without needing to explain why they had come. That sounds like her. Maris studied him over the top of her glasses. You are named successor trustee. Abram's first response was not gratitude. It was suspicion. Why? That question appears nowhere in the instrument. What happens if I refuse? A local charitable foundation becomes trustee. They may preserve the land, but they are not required to keep the house in personal use. And if I accept? You manage the property under the trust terms. You may live here. You may use trust funds for maintenance, Kepler's care, and approved community purposes. Can I sell it? No. Can anyone? Not for private profit. Abram looked around the damaged room. Watermarks spread over one wall. The repaired stove breathed quietly in the corner. Dorothy had not left him a reward. She had left him work. The realization felt strangely fair. Maris turned a page. There is also a contest. Lynette. Yes. Kepler's head lifted at the name. Maris noticed. Lynette alleges Dorothy lacked sufficient capacity when the trust was finalized. She also claims Franklin Crowder was promised an ownership interest in the property. Was he? There is evidence he contributed money to repairs. That is not the same as ownership. Abram's jaw tightened. Lynette told people I was dead. Maris uncapped her pen, then capped it again without writing. She told my office you had died overseas. She could not provide a date, place, or record. I did not accept the statement as fact. You tried to find me? For 9 months. Maris opened a second folder. Returned letters, tracing requests, military record correspondence, old addresses, and photocopies of forms filled the pages. Abram recognized locations he had once occupied and then abandoned. Coronado, Virginia Beach, a post office box in Nevada, a forwarding address that had expired years earlier. There were gaps, Maris said. You lived efficiently. I moved. You disappeared administratively. The sentence was not cruel. That made it difficult to resist. Abram turned one of the returned envelopes over in his hand. His name was typed across the front. The postmark was dated 8 months earlier. Someone had tried to tell him Dorothy was dead. The letter had traveled farther toward him than he had traveled toward her in 30 years. His thumb pressed into the paper until it bent. So Lynette lied. Yes. And because she lied, I did not know. Maris tilted her head. Do not make that sentence carry more than it can. Abram looked up. She obstructed the search, Maris continued. That may matter legally. It does not explain the previous 3 decades. The room seemed to contract around the words. Kepler shifted near the hallway. Abram placed the envelope back on the table with care. I did not ask for a judgment. No, you asked for an explanation. Those are rarely comfortable. Maris gathered the files and left copies of the trust documents behind. At the door, she looked toward the repaired bell cord lying across the chair. Dorothy used that for Kepler. June told me. The knot should be lower. He pulled with his teeth, not his paw. Abram glanced at it. Maris put on her gloves. She made practical systems for the things she was afraid to ask people to do. Then she stepped into the snow and drove away. For the rest of the afternoon, Abram repaired the bell cord. He lowered the loop, reinforced the knot, and tested the brass bell twice. The sound moved through the house in a clear, modest note. Kepler came from the hallway immediately. He looked at the cord, then at Abram. You remember. Kepler walked past him and touched the rope with his nose. Abram let it hang. Some repairs, he was beginning to understand, were not meant to make old things new. They were meant to let an old purpose continue. 3 days passed before the sewing room door opened. Abram had stopped trying to approach it. He cleaned the kitchen, replaced 2 broken window latches, read the trust papers, fed Kepler 6 small meals according to Laurel's schedule. At night, the dog returned to the same place across the sewing room threshold. On the 4th evening, Abram placed the blue tea tin on the floor several feet from the door. He did not speak. Kepler watched from the hallway. Abram sat with his back against the opposite wall, knees raised, hands loose over them. The stove clicked in the next room. Wind moved softly against the house. An hour passed. Kepler rose. He approached the tin, smelled the lid, then looked toward the closed room. Abram remained still. Kepler stepped aside. He did not invite Abram. He merely stopped preventing him. Abram stood slowly and opened the door. The room smelled of cloth, cedar, and the dry sweetness of old paper. A sewing machine sat beneath the window. Spools of thread lined one shelf by color. Dorothy's pale blue cardigan hung over the back of a chair as if she had stepped away before supper. Abram did not touch it. He crossed to the narrow desk. The drawers held scissors, chalk, pins, bills, and scraps of fabric. Nothing dramatic, nothing hidden. Then he noticed the lower drawer did not extend as far as the others. Hector's work, he thought. A false back slid free beneath Abram's fingers. Behind it lay a bundle of letters tied with gray ribbon. His name appeared on the first envelope. Abram sat at the desk. The earliest letter was angry. Dorothy wrote that he had come home from deployment and spent 3 days repairing a fence while avoiding every question she asked. She accused him of making usefulness a substitute for intimacy. Another letter, written years later, spoke of Franklin. She told Abram that Franklin was kind, impatient with instructions, and terrible at peeling apples. She wrote that loving another man had not erased what happened between them, nor had it repaired it. A later letter described Lynette moving into Bellwether Orchard after Franklin's death. Dorothy wrote that Lynette was grieving, proud, and convinced every kindness contained a hidden price. Some letters ended after 1 paragraph, some after 1 sentence. One contained nothing but the date and the words, "I was angry with you today, and you were not even here." That seems inefficient. Abram gave a short, broken laugh. Kepler lay near the doorway, watching. The letters did not build toward a confession. They contradicted one another. Dorothy missed him in one and wished never to hear his name in the next. She defended Franklin, criticized herself, resented Lynette, then worried she had been unfair. The messiness made them true. Near the bottom of the bundle was a hotel receipt from Denver. Abram unfolded the letter attached to it. Dorothy had attended a veterans gathering 12 years earlier. Hector had driven her because she no longer trusted herself on long highways. Abram remembered the event. He had spoken briefly about reintegration after service, though the word had always sounded like machinery being reassembled. Dorothy had stood outside the reception room. She had seen him laughing with Elise Mercer, the widow of a teammate killed years before. Elise had held Abram's arm while telling a story. Dorothy assumed they were married. She left before he saw her. "You looked peaceful," she had written. "I decided that entering the room would be selfish." Abram closed his eyes. Elise had remarried a schoolteacher 2 years before that gathering. She had held Abram's arm because her balance was poor after hip surgery. A mistake, nothing more than a mistake. Yet it had consumed 12 years. Abram pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead. He had stayed away because he believed Dorothy had a complete life. Dorothy had walked away because she believed the same of him. They had both called it mercy. Mercy, he thought, was sometimes cowardice dressed in clean clothes. The last letter was not sealed. The handwriting had grown smaller and less steady. Dorothy wrote that Bellwether had become a house full of sound but short on companionship. She did not name Lynette's cruelties in detail. She did not ask Abram to punish anyone. She wrote about Kepler. He still waits outside my room when my breathing turns bad. He brings my gloves even when I have nowhere to go. He believes routine can save us. Perhaps sometimes it can. Then, if you are alive, and if there is still enough kindness in you to answer a request from someone who no longer has the right to make one, please see that he is cared for. Abram stopped reading. Kepler had risen. He stood beside the desk, not touching Abram. The final lines waited. Do not make this house a monument to what we ruined. Open it. Use it. Let someone laugh in the kitchen. Let the dog learn that waiting is not his only purpose. Abram lowered the paper. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then Kepler placed Dorothy's faded shawl beside Abram's boot. Not in his lap, not against his hand. Close enough. Abram slid from the chair to the floor. He opened his arms without reaching. Kepler hesitated. The dog's body stiffened when Abram's hand first touched his shoulder. His breath came fast. Then, slowly, the tension eased. Kepler lowered his silvered head against Abram's chest. Abram held him. The sob came without dignity. It bent him forward until his forehead rested against the dark fur between Kepler's ears. He did not cry because Dorothy had forgiven him. The letters offered no such comfort. He cried because she had lived a full, difficult, imperfect life beyond him, and because he had arrived too late to ask which parts of it had hurt. Kepler remained there until Abram's breathing steadied. Outside, evening settled blue over the orchard. Inside the sewing room, the letters lay open across the desk, each one a road neither of them had taken. Abram did not promise the dead that he would make everything right. He only kept one hand on Kepler's back and listened to the house around them. For the first time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt inhabited by everything that had failed to arrive. Lynette Crowder arrived at Bellwether Orchard just before noon, when the winter sun had turned the snow into a field of hard white light. Abram saw the black SUV stop beyond the porch. Kepler was asleep near the stove, one silvered muzzle resting on his paws. The dog woke before the engine died. His head rose, not quickly, not in alarm, in recognition. Abram was standing at the dining table with Dorothy's trust document spread before him. He watched Kepler's body change, the shoulders stiffening, the torn ear drawing backward, the breath becoming shallow. Then the passenger door opened. Lynette stepped into the snow wearing a long burgundy coat buttoned to the throat. She was tall enough to carry herself with severity and thin enough that the straight lines of the coat made her seem sharper than she was. Her dark auburn hair, threaded with silver along the part, had been pulled into a low knot so tight that even the wind could not disturb it. A ring of old keys hung from one gloved hand. Most of them, Abram suspected, no longer opened anything. Travis Crowder climbed out from the driver's side. He was larger than Lynette by nearly a head, thick through the neck and shoulders, with a laborer's old strength settled beneath the heavier body of a man who no longer did much labor himself. His dark blue work coat hung open over a gray-red flannel shirt. A short, trimmed beard covered his broad jaw. He shut the vehicle door harder than necessary. Kepler rose. Abram folded the trust papers and placed them in a drawer. "Stay," he said quietly. The word was not a command he expected Kepler to obey. It was an offer of structure. Kepler remained near the stove, though his eyes followed the figures crossing the yard. Lynette did not knock. She tried the front door first. When it failed to open, she used one of the old keys. It turned halfway, scraped uselessly, and stopped. Abram opened the door from inside. Lynette looked at him with the strained composure of someone who had rehearsed anger during a long drive and now disliked finding the audience already prepared. "So you changed the locks." "They were changed before I arrived." Her fingers closed around the keys. Behind her, Travis glanced past Abram into the house. "You going to let us stand in the cold?" he asked. Abram stepped aside, but not far. "The door stays open." Travis smiled without warmth. "Expecting trouble?" "No, preventing confusion." Lynette entered first. Snow melted from her boots onto the worn floorboards. She looked around the living room, noting the repaired stove, the patched ceiling, and Dorothy's chair beside the window. Nothing in her expression softened. Travis came in behind her, filling the entryway with the smell of cold leather and engine oil. Kepler moved at once. He crossed the room and stopped near Dorothy's chair. Not in front of Abram. In front of the chair, Travis noticed. "That thing still here?" Abram closed the inner storm door, but left the main door open to the porch. "His name is Kepler. It used to be a dog." Kepler's lip did not lift. He simply held his ground. Lynette removed one glove and pulled a folded document from her bag. Her bare hand was pale from the cold. The knuckles reddened. "I did not come to discuss the dog." She placed the paper on the table. The document was handwritten, dated 19 years earlier, and signed by Dorothy and Franklin Crowder. Abram read it slowly. Franklin had agreed to contribute funds from the sale of his previous home toward repairs to Bellwether's greenhouse and delinquent property taxes. In return, Dorothy promised that he would always have a home at the orchard for the remainder of his life. Lynette watched Abram's face. "My father paid to save this place. He helped repair it. He sold his house. He lived here afterward. He invested in it." Abram looked at the signature again. "The paper says he could live here for life. It says Bellwether would be his home. It does not say it would become his property." Lynette's mouth tightened. "You would know a great deal about what words do not say." The strike landed cleanly. Abram let it. She stepped closer to the table. "You vanished for 30 years. You did not sit through my father's chemotherapy. You did not clean him when he could no longer stand. You did not replace the greenhouse glass after hail destroyed it. You did not listen to Dorothy complain about the orchard taxes, or the boiler, or the roof. No. And now you arrive after she is dead, read a few letters, and call yourself trustee. I have not called myself anything. You accepted control. I accepted responsibility." Lynette laughed once. It was not loud. It was worse than loud. Men like you always rename what they take. Behind her, Travis began walking toward the hallway. Abram looked up. "Where are you going?" "To see what condition the office is in." "No," Travis kept moving. "You don't own the air in here. Neither do you." The room changed. Not dramatically. Nothing shattered. No one raised a weapon. But Abram felt the old recognition move through him, a man testing distance, measuring whether another person would yield space before words had to become action. Travis stepped closer than conversation required. Abram did not step back. He shifted slightly so the open front door remained visible over Travis's shoulder. Then he took out his phone. Lynette frowned. "What are you doing?" "Calling Hector." "For what?" "A witness." Travis's expression flattened. Abram tapped another control. A small light appeared above the front window. "The porch camera is recording now." "You installed cameras?" Lynette asked, after someone threatened Otis and chained Kepler outside. Travis's eyes changed before his face did. A pause, brief but real. Then he smiled. "You have proof of that?" "Not yet." "Then be careful what you accuse people of." Abram's voice stayed level. "I did not name anyone." For several seconds, Travis did not move. Then Kepler shifted beside Dorothy's chair. Travis turned toward him. The silver lighter appeared in his hand. He opened it with his thumb. Click. Closed it. Click. Kepler's body lowered. The sound was small, but Abram saw the reaction immediately. The dog's ears flattened. His eyes locked on Travis's hand. Travis noticed and seemed amused. "Still jumpy." "Put it away," Abram said. "It is a lighter. It is making him afraid. That dog is afraid of his own shadow." Kepler stepped forward and placed himself directly between Travis and the chair. His rear leg trembled from arthritis. The thin fur around his scarred neck lifted slightly. He did not bark. Lynette looked at him. Something uncertain passed through her face, then hardened. Dorothy spent more on that animal than she ever did helping family. Kepler recoiled, not from the words, from her voice. He backed away so sharply that one hind paw slid against the floor. His gaze dropped. The posture was immediate and practiced, as if the sentence belonged to a room he remembered too well. Abram felt anger rise in him, hot and simple. For one dangerous second, he wanted it to remain simple. He wanted Lynette to become only cruel, Travis only violent, Dorothy only wronged, and himself only late. But Kepler's fear had not been created in one afternoon. Nor had Lynette's bitterness. Abram moved between the dog and the couple. "You are leaving." Lynette stared at him. "We have not finished." "We have." Travis stepped forward. Abram did not reach for him. He did not raise his hands. He only turned his body enough to keep the door open and the camera behind Travis. A vehicle engine sounded outside. Hector Boone's green truck came around the bend, ladder tied across its roof. Travis glanced toward the window. That was enough. The imbalance he had been trying to create vanished. Hector entered carrying a toolbox, a red carpenter's pencil behind one ear. He looked at Lynette, then Travis, then Kepler crouched near the stove. "I missed something cheerful," he said. Lynette gathered the handwritten agreement from the table. "This is not over." "No," as Abram said. "It is documented." Her eyes held his. "You think Dorothy chose you because she loved you." Abram looked at the old keys in her hand. "No." The answer unsettled her. He continued, "I think she chose me because she believed I might protect something without owning it." Lynette's face tightened, as if the words had struck closer than accusation. Travis opened the lighter again. Click! Hector looked at him. "You planning to burn something, or do you just need attention?" Travis closed it. They left without another word. The SU-5 reversed down the drive, its tires cutting dark channels through the clean snow. Kepler watched until it disappeared. Then he walked to the sewing room door and lay down across the threshold. He refused food that evening. Abram warmed broth. Kepler turned away. He placed the bowl farther from him. The dog did not move. At midnight, Abram found him in the same place, eyes open, chin resting on Dorothy's faded shawl. Abram sat against the opposite wall. He did not ask Kepler to come closer. The house settled around them. Pipes clicked. Wind brushed dry snow against the windows. The silence between them was different from the silence Abram had once used to escape Dorothy. This silence was company. Near dawn, Kepler shifted his head toward Abram but did not rise. Abram remained there until daylight. Over the following week, the story of Lynette became less clean. June remembered hearing Dorothy cry after arguments about selling the western orchard. She also remembered Lynette driving Dorothy to medical appointments when no one else could. Otis gave a written statement describing Travis searching the storage shed and demanding access to old financial records. Maris found withdrawals from Dorothy's account during the years Lynette lived at Bellwether. Some had receipts attached: furnace repairs, medication, groceries, Franklin's old debts. Others did not. Laurel provided medical records showing Dorothy had understood the nature of the trust when she signed it. Her physician's notes described her as physically frail but mentally clear. Then Maris recovered a saved voicemail from Dorothy's old phone account. Abram listened alone at the dining table. Lynette's voice came through first, tense but controlled. "You are sitting on land worth more than anything Dad ever left me." Dorothy answered, tired and breathless. "It is not sitting. It is growing. You cannot maintain it. That does not mean you get to sell it. You would rather give it to strangers. I would rather it remain useful." There was a long pause. Then Lynette said, "You always find something helpless to love because helpless things cannot leave you." The recording ended. Abram sat without moving. The cruelty of the sentence was undeniable. So was the pain beneath it. Hector arrived near sunset with replacement boards for the greenhouse. Abram played him the recording. Hector listened once. Then he removed his cap and rubbed a hand over his white hair. "She cared for Franklin," he said. "That excuses this? No? Then why say it? Because you are trying to decide whether she is a villain. Villains are convenient. Lynette was 29 when Franklin got sick. She left a job in Missoula and came back. Spent 4 years changing dressings, cleaning blood, arguing with insurance offices. And afterward she believed sacrifice should become ownership." Abram looked toward the orchard. Hector continued. Dorothy was exhausted. Lynette was angry. Franklin died before either of them said what they thought they were owed. Kepler emerged from the hallway and stopped near them. He looked first at Hector, then at Abram. Abram thought of the old keys in Lynette's hand. Keys to doors that had changed locks. Keys she carried because carrying them felt like evidence. He thought of himself preserving a 30-year silence because admitting he had chosen it would have been harder than calling it mercy. Different wounds, the same temptation, to turn pain into permission. Kepler walked past them and placed Dorothy's wool glove beside the back door. Not a warning, a routine. Outside time. Abram picked it up. He understood then that the conflict ahead would not be settled by proving one person had suffered and another had not. Everyone in the story had suffered. The question was what each of them had chosen to build from it. Lynette had built a claim. Travis had built an opportunity. Abram had built an absence. Dorothy, imperfectly and too late, had tried to build a table. Kepler stood by the door, waiting. Abram put on his coat. This time, when he opened the door, the dog followed him into the winter light. By the time the first section of porch railing stood straight again, Bellwether Orchard had begun to look less abandoned and more undecided. The distinction mattered to Abram. Abandoned things had been left behind. Undecided things could still become something. He and Hector worked through the mornings while the winter light was clear. Hector replaced rotten boards and complained about the quality of modern screws. Abram repaired window frames, sealed the pantry wall, and learned which floorboards groaned because they were old and which groaned because they were dangerous. Kepler followed the work from room to room. He had gained enough weight that his ribs no longer shaped every breath. The dark amber fur along his chest had begun to shine again, though the scarred ring around his neck remained visible. His rear leg still stiffened after sleep. Laurel came every few days to examine him, adjust his feeding schedule, and remind Abram that improvement was not permission to hurry. "He is stronger," she said one afternoon, pressing 2 fingers along Kepler's spine. "That does not mean he is finished being afraid." Abram looked toward the hallway. People confuse those things too. Laurel glanced at him. Some of them become Navy SEALs. Abram gave her the smallest possible smile. Kepler, unimpressed by human insight, stole one of Laurel's gloves and placed it beside the back door. The knock came shortly after she left. Deputy Celia Ward stood on the porch in a county winter jacket, her patrol hat tucked beneath one arm. She was 47, with a compact frame, dark hair pulled tightly behind her head, and a face that looked more tired than stern. Snow had melted along the shoulders of her uniform. Kepler moved toward the doorway, then stopped behind Abram. Celia noticed. "I handled June Ellicott's call," she said. Abram did not invite her to soften the statement. "Yes." "I spoke to Lynette. She sent a copy of a kennel transfer request and said transport had been delayed." "You did not come out?" "No." "Why?" Celia looked past him toward the orchard. "Because the road was bad, because the property was in probate, because I had a domestic assault call and a stranded vehicle that morning, because the paperwork looked plausible." Abram waited. She continued, "All of those things are true. None of them make the dog less chained." The honesty kept him from answering too quickly. Celia removed a folder from beneath her arm. "I want Laurel's report, photographs of the neck injuries, June's timeline, and Otis's statement. I can open an animal neglect file and a separate inquiry into Travis threatening Otis." "You want forgiveness first?" "No." Her eyes met his. "I want the record corrected first." Abram stepped aside. Kepler did not approach her, but he did not retreat either. Celia placed the folder on the table and remained only long enough to explain what she needed. She did not defend the office. She did not promise an arrest. She said only that paperwork had once been used to hide a living animal from view, and this time she intended the paper to show what had happened. After she left, Abram found himself thinking about the difference, not between good people and bad people, between apology and repair. The following morning, Hector pried up 3 damaged boards in Dorothy's sewing room. The leak had rotted the floor beneath the window. Abram moved the sewing table, then reached for the old chair where Dorothy's pale blue cardigan still rested. Kepler appeared in the doorway. Abram lifted the chair. Kepler lunged forward, not at Abram, at the empty space where the chair had stood. He clawed at the floor, whining low in his throat. His breathing changed so quickly that Abram set the chair down at once, but not in the exact place. Kepler circled it, disoriented. Then he scratched at the doorframe, hard enough to split one nail. "Easy," Abram said. The word meant nothing. Kepler pushed his muzzle beneath the cardigan, trembling. Hector stopped working. "He thinks you are taking the room apart. I am taking the rotten boards apart. He does not know the difference." Abram crouched several feet away. The instinct to finish the repair pressed at him. Rotten wood did not improve because grief objected. Water damage did not care about memories. Still, he looked at the chair. A practical object. Worn fabric, loose joint at the back. To Kepler, it was a fixed point in a world that had already removed too much. Abram stood and put the chair exactly where it had been. Kepler remained tense for several minutes. Then he lowered himself beside it. Hector rested both hands on the handle of his pry bar. "You cannot preserve every nail." "I know. And you cannot rebuild the place like no one lived here." Abram looked at the damaged floor. During his years in service, restoring a space had meant clearing it, securing it, making it functional. Memory had been an obstacle only when it slowed the work. Bellwether was teaching him a different discipline. He and Hector repaired only the boards that threatened to collapse. They marked the chair's position in pencil before moving it again, and Abram let Kepler watch each step. The dog remained uneasy, but he did not panic a second time. From then on, Abram changed the house more carefully. He left Dorothy's cardigan on the chair. He kept the worn rug beneath the kitchen table, even though the edges curled. He repaired the bell cord without replacing its frayed wooden handle. The house did not need to become untouched. It needed to remain recognizable. 3 days later, Kepler began collecting gloves. The first belonged to Abram. The second was Hector's. The third had been buried in a basket near the mudroom. By late morning, 5 gloves lay in a crooked row before the greenhouse door. Hector stared at them. I knew that dog had criminal habits. Kepler stood beside the row, looking toward Abram. Laurel had once explained that Dorothy used paired objects to direct his attention. Gloves meant outside work. A cluster of them meant follow. Abram put on his coat. The greenhouse sat behind the orchard, its roof half covered by snow. Several glass panels were cracked, and one section had been boarded from the inside. Kepler stopped at the frozen door and waited. Abram forced the latch with warm water and the edge of a screwdriver. Cold air moved out, carrying the smells of soil, rust, and dead leaves. Inside, wooden tables stood beneath the pale glass. Seed trays had dried into gray blocks. Clay pots lined one wall. In another season, the place might have glowed green. Kepler walked to a cabinet beneath the central workbench. He did not scratch or bark. He simply sat beside it. Abram opened the doors. Inside were gardening records, folded tablecloths, jars of pencils, and a thick binder labeled in Dorothy's handwriting. Winter table. He carried it to the nearest bench. The first pages held names, not donors, not customers. People. Eleanor Graves, widowed, no longer driving after dark. Samuel Pike, hearing loss, hates being fussed over. Marta Bell, bring low-salt soup. Louis Kenner, will not come without his terrier. Beside many names, Dorothy had written the names of animals. Dogs. Cats. One parrot with a warning underlined twice. Farther into the binder were sketches of the greenhouse, long tables near the windows, a small stove in the corner, a shelf for books, hooks for coats, a fenced run outside for older dogs. Dorothy's notes described opening bellwether one day each week during winter. No applications, no speeches, no requirement to prove loneliness. A hot meal, a warm chair, permission to bring the animal that made leaving home possible. On one page, she had written, "People do not always need rescuing. Sometimes they need somewhere they can arrive without pretending they are fine." Abram read the sentence twice. Hector leaned over his shoulder. "She talked about this," he said. "Why did no one help her?" "Some did." "Not enough." Hector looked toward the cracked roof. "She was sick. Lynette fought her over the land. I told Dorothy the greenhouse needed more money than she had." "And she stopped?" "No, she kept planning. Stopping would have been more sensible." Kepler moved beneath the workbench and lay down among the fallen gloves. Abram looked around the ruined greenhouse. Until that moment, bellwether had meant Dorothy's final possession, a thing he had arrived too late to deserve but might still protect. The binder changed the question. Protect it for what? A house kept exactly as the dead left it was not always a home. Sometimes it was only a well-maintained absence. Abram closed the binder. The sound echoed lightly beneath the glass roof. He understood, with a discomfort close to shame, that he had begun to imagine bellwether as a private sentence. He would repair it, care for Kepler, preserve Dorothy's chair, and live among reminders until regret had consumed the remaining years. It would have looked like devotion. Dorothy had specifically asked him not to do that. That evening, Maris came to the orchard with figures from Franklin's records. He had contributed a substantial amount to the greenhouse repairs 19 years earlier. Some payments were documented. Others appeared in Dorothy's handwritten ledgers. None gave Franklin ownership, but the contribution was real. "Lynette's legal claim is weak," Maris said. "Her grievance is not entirely invented." Abram sat at the kitchen table with the winter table binder open beside him. "What would settlement look like?" Maris looked up. "That depends on whether you want to win or finish. Both would be convenient. Convenience has not distinguished itself in this family." Abram proposed repayment from the trust for the documented portion of Franklin's investment. Lynette would receive his tools, photographs, personal papers, and several pieces of furniture stored in the shed. A section of the restored greenhouse would bear Franklin's name. In exchange, she would withdraw the challenge to the trust and acknowledge that her father's right to live at Bellwether had ended with his death. Maris listened without interrupting. "You are not required to offer the hat much. I am not paying her for the land. No change. I am recognizing what Franklin put into it." Maris turned the fountain pen between her fingers. "That distinction may matter more to you than to her. It matters to me." The meeting took place 2 days later in Maris's office. Lynette arrived alone at first. She listened while Maris explained the proposal. Her face remained guarded, but when Abram mentioned returning Franklin's tools and naming the eastern greenhouse corner for him, something in her expression shifted. "My father built those benches," she said. "Then his name belongs there," Abram replied. Lynette looked down at the agreement. For the first time, the fight seemed to loosen. Then the office door opened. Travis entered without removing his coat. He had been waiting in the hallway. Lynette's shoulders changed before she looked at him. Travis read the first page, then laughed. "They are buying you off with old furniture." "It is not a purchase," Maris said. "It is surrender." Lynette's hand tightened around the paper. Travis leaned toward her. "Your father sold his house for that place. Now they want you grateful for a plaque." Abram watched Lynette's face close again. Travis continued, "The resort company is still interested. The western parcel alone is worth more than this settlement." Maris's eyes sharpened. "What resort company?" Travis ignored her. He spoke only to Lynette. "If you sign, you give away the only thing your father left that matters." The sentence found its target. Lynette put down the pen. "I need more time." "You have had months," Maris said. Lynette looked at Abram. "No." The word was quiet. Then she stood and left with Travis. Back at Bellwether, Abram placed the winter table binder on the greenhouse bench. The dispute had changed. It was no longer about whether he had inherited a house. It was about whether Bellwether would become the place Dorothy had imagined, or acreage measured by a developer's map. That night, Abram woke and looked toward the hallway. Kepler was not lying across Dorothy's sewing room door. He had settled halfway between that room and Abram's bedroom. From there, he could see both. Abram remained still, unwilling to make the moment larger than Kepler intended. The dog opened one eye, then closed it again. The distance was only a few feet, but for Kepler, it was the first ground not entirely claimed by the dead. The storm reached Larkspur Valley after dark. By 7, snow had erased the orchard fence. By 8, the apple trees beyond the kitchen window had become black shapes drifting in and out of white. Wind drove powder beneath the porch roof and rattled the repaired greenhouse panels with a sound like fingernails across glass. Maris had called before the signal weakened. She was preparing to file Dorothy's medical records, the trust documents, the financial ledgers, and a digital copy of the old voicemail before the probate hearing. The originals remained at Bellwether until morning because the county office had closed early for the storm. "Do not reorganize anything," Maris had said. "I know how evidence works. You know how ammunition works. Paper is less forgiving." Then the line had broken. Abram placed the financial ledger, the voice recorder, and the copied bank statements inside a metal document case beneath the kitchen bench. He checked the porch camera, tested the outdoor lights, and locked the greenhouse door. The preparations felt excessive. That was why he made them. At 76, experience had not made Abram fearless. It had made him suspicious of the moment when a person decided caution would look foolish. Kepler lay halfway down the hallway in his soft green harness, where he could see both Abram's room and Dorothy's sewing room door. His coat had grown fuller over the past weeks. The dark amber along his chest had regained its depth, though the silver around his muzzle made every alert expression look older than it was. Abram banked the stove and went to bed fully dressed. The bell rang at 11:43. One hard note, a pause, then two more. Abram opened his eyes. The sound came from the back door, not the front porch. Dorothy's brass bell gave a clear, urgent voice through the dark house. Kepler stood beneath the low cord, teeth still near the wooden handle. For a heartbeat, Abram saw not a dog, but a system functioning exactly as it had been designed. Dorothy had taught Kepler how to make another person listen when she could not call loudly enough herself. "What is it?" Kepler turned toward the kitchen window. Headlights moved behind the orchard. They vanished, then appeared again between the trees. Abram swung his legs from the bed. His left knee protested immediately, stiff from the cold. He ignored it long enough to take his phone, slip on his boots, and switch on the exterior camera feed. A dark SUV had stopped beyond the main drive. Two figures stepped out. Lynette wore a pale winter hat and her burgundy coat. Travis carried something long beside his leg. Abram enlarged the image, a pry bar. He called Celia first. Her voice came through beneath the hiss of road noise. "I am 10 miles south. Visibility is bad. They are on the property. Stay inside. Lock the doors. Do not confront them. I heard you." Abram. He knew what she meant. Hearing an instruction and obeying it had never been the same discipline. He called Hector next. The old carpenter answered on the fourth ring. "If this is about the gutter can die with dignity. Travis is here." A pause. "I am coming." "No, Celia is already on the road. Stay on the phone if I call again. You think I am letting you collect all the bad decisions? I think your truck will end up in a ditch." Hector swore, but agreed. Abram activated every exterior light. White beams flooded the yard, turning the storm into a wall of moving sparks. Lynette stopped beside the greenhouse. Travis did not. Abram used the outdoor speaker. "You are being recorded. Deputy Ward has been called. Leave the property." Lynette looked toward the house. Travis raised the pry bar and struck the greenhouse latch. The sound carried through the storm. Metal against wood. Once, twice. Kepler growled. Abram held one hand low. Door. Kepler moved to the kitchen entrance and positioned himself there, exactly as Laurel and Abram had practiced. The command did not mean attack. It meant hold a boundary. Outside, Lynette seized Travis's arm. Even through the camera, Abram could see her mouth moving. Travis jerked free. The greenhouse latch split. Abram could remain inside. That was the intelligent choice. The police were coming. The evidence had been moved. The cameras were recording. Then Travis forced the door wide and disappeared into the greenhouse. Lynette followed. Abram watched the video feed for 5 seconds. The greenhouse contained oil lamps, dry timber, old wiring, and a propane heater Hector had not yet connected. A man swinging metal in the dark could destroy more than records. Abram took the short cargo strap from beside the mudroom and stepped into the yard. Kepler followed. "No." The dog stopped at the threshold but whined low. Abram looked back. Kepler's body leaned toward him. The torn ear flattened under the snow, blowing through the open door. Abram fastened the long training lead to the harness. Back. Kepler retreated 1 step. Abram led him onto the porch, then down into the yard. The storm swallowed sound beyond 20 feet. Snow pressed against Abram's face and entered the collar of his old field jacket. His knee loosened after the first painful steps, then began to ache with each one. Inside the greenhouse, a flashlight beam moved wildly across the glass. Abram stopped well outside the doorway. "Travis." The light turned toward him. Travis emerged holding the pry bar. Snow caught in his short beard and melted along the shoulders of his dark work coat. "You should have stayed inside, old man." Lynette appeared behind him. Her face had lost its practiced hardness. "He said Franklin's tools were still here," she called. "He said that was all." Travis looked back at her. "Be quiet." Abram heard the change in Lynette's breathing, even through the wind. "What were you looking for?" she demanded. Travis stepped closer to Abram instead of answering. Behind him, an overturned file box lay open across the greenhouse floor. Papers had scattered beneath the benches. Not Franklin's tools. Records. Lynette saw them. Her expression changed slowly, not into innocence, but recognition. "You came for the ledger." Travis pointed the pry bar toward the house. "He has no right to use your mistakes against you. You told me we were taking Dad's things. I am protecting what is ours." "No," Lynette said. "You are protecting the sale." Travis turned. The movement was sharp enough that Kepler surged forward. Abram felt the lead pull tight. "Stay." Kepler froze. Every line of the dog's body strained toward Travis. His lips drew back, but he did not advance. The obedience was not submission. Kepler was choosing Abram's voice over the fear in his own body. Travis saw it. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. Then Lynette grabbed the pry bar. "Give it to me." Travis shoved her. She fell sideways into the snow, one shoulder striking the greenhouse step. Kepler barked once, a deep, explosive sound. Travis swung toward him. Abram shortened the lead. "Back." Kepler took one unwilling step behind Abram. Travis came forward. The pry bar remained low, but low weapons could rise. Abram did not square his shoulders or plant himself for a fight. His body could no longer afford pride disguised as stance. He moved backward toward the greenhouse steps. One pace, then another. Travis mistook retreat for weakness and followed faster. The lowest wooden step had been polished by blown snow and refrozen water. Abram had nearly slipped there that afternoon. He stepped around it. Travis stepped onto it. His boot slid. The pry bar rose instinctively as his arms fought for balance. Abram moved. He caught Travis's wrist with both hands, turned the arm toward the man's back, and drove his weight against the elbow. The motion was compact, built on timing rather than strength. Pain tore through Abram's right wrist. Travis dropped to one knee. Abram looped the cargo strap around the trapped wrist and the greenhouse railing. Travis twisted violently, pulling Abram forward. The old injury in Abram's left knee gave way. He went down hard. For a second, his face was inches from Travis's. Abram saw rage there. He felt his own answer it. The pry bar lay in the snow within reach. One blow could end the struggle. One blow could make every year of restraint irrelevant. Abram's hand moved toward it. Then Kepler appeared between them, not attacking, standing. His body blocked the weapon, his eyes fixed on Abram. Dorothy's dog did not growl at Travis. He watched Abram. The moment broke. Abram used the strap instead, tightening it until Travis's wrist was secured to the railing. Sirens sounded faintly below the orchard. Travis stopped fighting. Celia arrived with another deputy less than 2 minutes later. They crossed the yard with flashlights and drawn commands. Travis was pulled upright, searched, and placed in handcuffs. Lynette remained seated in the snow. Kepler stood between her and Travis until the officers led him away. Celia inspected the broken greenhouse door, the scattered documents, and the pry bar. She spoke to Abram only after checking Lynette's shoulder. "You were told to stay inside." "Yes." "Are you injured?" "Yes." "Do you understand that was not an invitation to make this a pattern?" "Yes." Celia looked at Kepler. "At least one of you follows instructions." Kepler sneezed snow from his muzzle. Hector arrived after the patrol vehicles, furious, frightened, and carrying a shovel as if it were a legal credential. By 1 a.m, the statements had been taken. Travis was arrested for unlawful entry, property damage, and assaulting Lynette. The animal neglect investigation would remain separate, though Otis's statement and the earlier footage now carried greater weight. Celia took the damaged documents into evidence and arranged for Maris to receive certified copies. Lynette refused an ambulance. Laurel, called by Hector, examined her shoulder in the kitchen and declared it bruised but not dislocated. Abram sat on the floor beside the stove with an ice pack over his wrist. His knee shook each time he tried to straighten it. The room smelled of wet coats, antiseptic, and burned coffee. Lynette sat against the opposite cabinet. Her hat was gone. Strands of auburn hair had come loose from the knot and clung to her face. Without her burgundy coat buttoned like armor, she looked smaller and much more tired. Kepler lay between them, not touching either person. His head faced the door. Lynette stared at the scar around his neck. "I knew he had not gone to a rescue," she said. Abram said nothing. Travis said Otis would keep feeding him until someone came. I knew that did not sound true. "Did you check?" "No." The answer came without defense. Snow hissed against the windows. Lynette folded her hands together. "I told Maris you were dead." "I know. I did not know if you were. You did not try to know." "No." Abram looked at her. "Why?" Lynette's mouth trembled once before hardening again. "Because if she found you, you would come back. Dorothy would give you everything. My father would disappear from the story." "Franklin did not disappear." "He did to her. That is not true. You were not here." The words landed between them. Abram could have answered with the letters, with Dorothy's ledgers, with Franklin's name written into the greenhouse plans. Instead, he said, "Neither were you at the end." Lynette looked down. "No." There was no victory in the admission, only two absences facing one another. After a while, Lynette said, "I do not expect you to forgive me." "Good." She gave a short, exhausted laugh that nearly became a sob. Abram adjusted the ice pack. "I do not expect it from you either." Kepler shifted. He placed one front paw farther into the space between them, then lowered his chin again. Lynette watched him. He never liked Travis. Kepler did not trust him. He did not trust me either. Abram looked at the dog's torn ear, the silver muzzle, and the patient eyes turned toward the door. He had reasons. Lynette nodded. The stove settled with a soft click. Neither of them spoke of ownership after that. Not the house, not Dorothy, not Franklin, not Kepler. For one night, they allowed the dead to belong to themselves. Outside, the storm continued, covering the tire tracks, the broken latch, and the place where Travis had fallen. Inside, Kepler remained between them, not as a judge, not as proof of innocence, only as the one living creature in the room who understood that no one should be left outside merely because the people indoors had not finished deciding who was right. The legal matters did not end with a single ruling. They ended in pieces. A hearing in February confirmed that Dorothy had understood the trust she created. Her physician's notes described her as physically frail, easily exhausted, and fully capable of making decisions about her property. Maris presented the records without drama. Laurel testified about Kepler's condition. June described the months after Dorothy's death. Hector explained Franklin's work on the greenhouse and the limits of the promise Dorothy had made him. The handwritten agreement was recognized for what it was, a promise that Franklin could remain at Bellwether for the rest of his life. It was not an inheritance. It had died when he did. Travis's criminal case followed another road. Charges were filed for unlawful entry, property damage, assault, intimidation of Otis, and animal neglect. The process moved slowly through interviews, reports, continuances, and the kind of language that reduced a night of fear into numbered paragraphs. Abram discovered that justice rarely arrived like a door being kicked open. More often, it came as a clerk correcting a date. Lynette withdrew her challenge to the trust after Maris drafted a civil settlement. She received Franklin's tools, photographs, papers, and several pieces of furniture stored in Bellwether's shed. The trust reimbursed a documented portion of the money Franklin had invested in the greenhouse. The payment did not declare that Lynette had owned the land. It acknowledged that Franklin had helped keep it standing. Abram insisted on that distinction. So did Maris. By early spring, Lynette had left Larkspur Valley to stay with a cousin in Oregon. She did not say goodbye in person. A small parcel arrived instead. Inside was Dorothy's old house key, the one Lynette had carried on Franklin's ring even after the lock no longer accepted it. Beneath the key sat a box of photographs. Franklin beside the greenhouse in shirt sleeves, holding a pane of glass. Dorothy asleep in a lawn chair, one hand resting on Kepler's back. Lynette, at 29, exhausted and unsmiling beside her father's hospital bed. The photographs did not defend anyone. They simply proved that every person in the dispute had once belonged to a moment no court could divide properly. A note lay at the bottom. I think I spent most of my life believing someone was about to take something from me. Abram read it twice. He did not write that he forgave her. He was not certain forgiveness worked when offered too early. Sometimes it became another way to close a difficult subject before anyone had finished understanding it. He wrote only, "Maybe all of us lived that way too long." Then he placed Dorothy's old key in the kitchen drawer, not on his own key ring. Winter Table opened the following December. It had taken nearly a year to reach that day. The greenhouse roof had been rebuilt with reinforced glass. Hector repaired the long workbenches and complained that Franklin had used too many nails, then quietly preserved every original board that could still bear weight. Maris established the trust accounts and produced a binder so heavily indexed that June claimed it could survive both fire and human personality. Celia connected the program with the county's senior outreach office. Laurel arranged a small animal care station near the greenhouse entrance with blankets, water bowls, paw balm, and a folding examination table no one was allowed to call a clinic. June took responsibility for food without being asked. She arrived before sunrise carrying 2 apple pies, 3 loaves of bread, and a pot of soup large enough to suggest military intentions. Hector lifted the lid and tasted it. His face changed. "You salted this?" "I supervised," June said. "That was not the question." June handed him the spoon. "Improve it then." Hector added water, potatoes, and enough black pepper to make the soup a different problem. No one gave a speech. That had been Abram's rule. He did not want a ribbon, a photograph, or a story in the local paper about a heroic veteran restoring a dead woman's dream. Too many things had already been simplified for public comfort. Winter Table opened at 11. By 11:15, 3 people had arrived. By noon, there were 12. An elderly man named Samuel Pike sat near the stove and pretended his hearing aid was broken whenever anyone asked about his health. Eleanor Graves brought a knitted bag containing 6 books, and no explanation for why she needed all of them. Marta Bell arrived with a jar of low-salt soup, despite June informing her that bringing soup to a meal centered around soup was an act of rebellion. Lewis Canner came last, accompanied by an old terrier named Wally, whose eyebrows made him look permanently offended by civilization. A yellow Labrador with a whitening face slept beneath the longest table, while 2 widows sat side by side above him. They spoke only once in the first hour. "Cold today," one said. "Yes, the other answered. Then they continued eating in companionable silence. Abram kept the stove fed and the walkway clear. He carried chairs, opened jars, adjusted a loose hinge, and checked the porch whenever tires sounded on the road. He did not lead the room. That surprised him. For most of his life, usefulness had meant taking control before others had to ask. At Winter Table, usefulness sometimes meant noticing that June had already filled the coffee pot, or letting Celia move a chair without correcting its angle, or allowing Hector to repair something badly enough that he could complain about repairing it again. Kepler lay near the greenhouse door in his soft green harness. He had gained back much of his strength. His coat had deepened into dark amber and black, though silver still framed his muzzle. The scar around his neck remained visible when he turned his head. At first, Abram expected him to patrol. Instead, Kepler watched. He watched Wally steal bread crusts. He watched the old Labrador dream beneath the table. He watched people enter carrying awkwardness, casseroles, canes, pet carriers, and the cautious expressions of those uncertain whether loneliness counted as a sufficient invitation. But he did not look toward Dorothy's sewing room, not once. Near the western wall stood a wooden box Abram had built from one of the greenhouse's original apple crates. On the front, he had painted "Letters for Dorothy." The name had been June's suggestion. The purpose was broader. Anyone could write to someone they had avoided, lost, disappointed, misunderstood, or loved too late. The person could be alive or dead. The letters did not have to be mailed. "They can be burned afterward," Hector had said. "They can also be sent," Maris replied. "That sounds administratively dangerous." By mid-afternoon, 6 envelopes rested inside the box. Abram waited until the room had quieted before taking a sheet of paper. He sat near the greenhouse window where winter sunlight spread across the table. For several minutes, he wrote nothing. Then, "Dorothy, Kepler is stronger. He still dislikes sudden changes, canned peas, and men who move chairs without consultation." Abram paused. Across the room, Kepler lifted his head as if hearing slander. Abram continued, "The greenhouse is open. Hector nearly destroyed the soup while trying to save it. June says this is false. The chair in your sewing room remains where you left it, although the floor beneath it no longer intends to collapse." He rested the pen. He had spent 30 years imagining the first sentence he might say to Dorothy if he saw her again. None had survived contact with death. So he wrote the truest thing he had. "I do not know whether any of this is enough. I do not know whether enough exists. I am not asking you to forgive me. I only want you to know that I will not leave because I am uncertain I belong here." The sentence made his hand stop. For most of his life, uncertainty had been his signal to withdraw. Leave before being dismissed. Go before needing to ask. Turn silence into proof that departure had been wise. He folded the letter and placed it inside the box. Then he took another sheet. This one was for Lynette. He wrote that a young apple tree had been grafted from the oldest surviving branch of Franklin's tree near the greenhouse. It would be ready to plant in spring. He invited her to return for it. No conditions, no demand for apology, no claim that they could become family. Just a tree with roots that came from something Franklin had once kept alive. Abram placed the second letter in an envelope and addressed it to Oregon. He did not know whether Lynette would answer. He had learned that sending a letter and controlling its arrival were different responsibilities. The afternoon faded. People gathered their coats. June wrapped leftover bread in paper. Celia helped Samuel Pike down the icy steps while he loudly insisted he required no help. Laurel checked the old Labrador's paws and refused payment from his owner. Hector stood in the middle of the greenhouse, surveying the empty bowls. "That went well," Abram said. "The soup survived despite interference." "Your interference." Hector put on his cap. "History will decide." Kepler followed the final guests to the door, then returned to the center of the room. He turned once and lay down beneath the long table, not beside the door, not at the hallway, not in front of Dorothy's room, in the middle. Abram watched him lower his head onto his paws while late sunlight moved across the scar on his neck. The dog had spent so long believing love meant standing guard over what might disappear. Now he slept while people left. He trusted some of them to return. The brass bell rang outside. The sound was softer than the night Kepler had used it to warn Abram, but it stopped him halfway through stacking chairs. One note, then another. Kepler opened his eyes but did not rise. Abram crossed the greenhouse and stepped into the house. At the front door stood an elderly man in a wool coat too thin for the weather. Snow had gathered along his shoulders. He held a crushed envelope in one hand and a knitted cap in the other. His face carried the uncertain embarrassment of someone who had arrived after an event and hoped the lateness might be mistaken for intention. "I saw the sign," the man said. "I thought this was open today." It was. The man glanced past Abram toward the warm greenhouse. "I suppose I missed it." Behind Abram, dishes clinked as June packed the kitchen. Hector laughed at something Celia said. Kepler's nails touched the floor once, then stopped. Abram looked at the envelope in the stranger's hand. "You come to write a letter?" The man gave a small shrug. "I came to decide whether I could." Snow moved through the bare orchard branches. The day had almost ended. The stove would need more wood. Abram's knee ached, and there were still chairs to stack. Once he would have called those reasons. Now they were only facts. Abram opened the door wider. "You have not missed it." The man hesitated at the threshold. Abram did not wait for him to explain whom the letter was for, why it was late, or what had kept him away. He stepped aside first. Behind him stood the house that silence, pride, grief, and money had nearly emptied. Ahead of him stood a stranger who did not know whether he had the right to enter. Abram held the door open. For the first time in 30 years, he did not require the other person to speak before he chose to stay. Sometimes healing does not come from changing the past. It begins when we stop running from it and choose to care for what is still in front of us. Abram could not recover the 30 years he had lost, but he could keep the door open, protect Kepler, and turn an empty house into a place of warmth. In our own lives, grace may look just as small. A letter finally sent, a phone call made, a chair pulled out for someone who feels alone. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, second chances, and quiet courage. May God give you the strength to say what matters, the humility to make amends, and the peace to remain when love asks you not to leave.